advisor with the Green Commodities program. I'm normally based in Costa Rica, but I am talking to you from Asunción in Paraguay. This workshop is part of the Green Commodities Community's online workshop series, which brings together the commodity professionals and project teams from around the world to learn about topics that we're all interested in and also to learn from each other. Today we're introducing the theme of futures methods, which is a strategic planning approach that helps organizations and projects handle uncertainties and unforeseen situations. So let's say that you have had your multi-stakeholder dialogue, you have developed your national action plan or your regional action plan, and now you need to go and implement the plan. Yet we know that you depend on for action on the action of many different people, and you're not fully in control of the action. And also, to make things even more complex, things in our surrounding, they change all the time, and they can be difficult to anticipate. So understanding our degree of control and our ability to predict the changes is key to our success. In GCP, we developed, of course, methodologies, and these methodologies help us develop robust processes. And the better we are to using the GCP methodologies, the better we are likely to handle our processes. I can only recommend that you work actively to strengthen the use of the methodologies in your work. But even with good planning and good risk management, something is likely to happen that you didn't expect, or something you expected to happen didn't happen. And then we tend to get stuck. We can get stuck waiting for our president to sign our national action plan, for instance, or we can we might be waiting to get the buy-in from our new government for a process that was started under the former government, or we can be caught in a struggle between a production country and buying countries, a political struggle. We can be waiting for new funding that fails to materialize, or we can encounter different types of administrative roadblocks, for instance. Lots of things can happen. And if we work better in a situation with uncertainty and limited control, then we can better steer our projects free of the obstacles. We believe that most of us would benefit knowing more about how to manage the uncertainties that we encounter. So we have searched for an expert to help us out. And we are happy to have found David Bent, who is with us in the workshop here today. Hi, David. For 13 years, David worked for the Forum for the Future, where he advised the companies on how to succeed commercially by preparing for and creating a sustainable world. Now David is advising various initiatives across climate, digital revolution, innovative systems, and sustainable finance. David is with us here in the next 90 minutes in this our participatory workshop to introduce the essentials of futures methods. Now, this is just an introduction. In the future, we could potentially provide more guidance and support in the subject throughout the Green Commodities community. And we'll talk to you more about that later in the event. So again, welcome to our workshop. And I just see that we have more participants logging on. We have Nadia. Hi, Nadia. Could we ask you to turn on your camera, please? So we can all see each other.
Hi, good morning. Yes,
Good
sure, I
morning.
will do it. Good
Thank
morning.
you. Thank you.
Sorry, let me turn it on just a
Right.
second.
So we just went ahead and started. I hope you don't mind. So right now I'd like to do a round of introduction. But because we are many people on the call, I would like to start by asking people who have not participated before in the green commodities community and in our online workshops to introduce themselves by saying the name, what they do, basically in 10 to 15 seconds each. Just go around. So the people of you who are new to this, just introduce yourselves because many of us old timers know each other already. And Nadia, we might start with you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Nadia Goodman. I work for ProForest. I have been working in the last 3 years in supporting the coordination of the TFA 2020, the African Palm Oil Initiative, where we have been working with 10 countries from West and Central Africa. And we work with multi-stakeholder approach as well. So we have been supporting the development of national action and action principles and action plans in coordination with the government, private sector, and civil society in each of those 10 countries that we have been working. And also we have been working at regional level in supporting the coordination of the Marrakesh. We support the development and production of the Marrakesh Declaration, which has been signed by 7 of the countries.
Right. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for that. We need to make it just a bit shorter from each, but it's very good to have you with us. So can we have next? I see Prasetyo also. Is that the first time participating?
I think so. I recognize a few faces here, but I think this is the first time for me here. Anyhow, just to keep it short, I'm Prasidio Wijaksono. I'm the SPOI implementation advisor. SPOI is the Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative. So I'm here with the Ibu Tree and Ibu Rini's team here, just helping out on all components of the initiative.
Perfect. And Maggie? Okay.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes.
It's me, Maggie. I'm with Ibu Tri and Ibu Rini and Pak Prastio. I'm based in North Sumatra, Indonesia, and I'm basically representative of UNDP for facilitating the dialogue with the government in North Sumatra and drafting together with the governments and other stakeholders for action plan, provincial action plan, and yeah.
Great.
And with the UNDP Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And next, please just jump in, everybody, when you get the chance.
Siam Su, he's a first timer as well.
Right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samsul Rusdi. I am the provincial platform specialist for West Kalimantan province. I also have the same work with Maggie, Ibu Rini, Ibu Tri, and the others, and especially for West Kalimantan. Now we're still under process to finalize the provincial action plan. Yeah, I hope we could meet the target within this month to finalize document.
Okay, great to have you with us all. Veronique, have you participated before?
No, thank you. Hello, this is, I already introduced myself for in the call, and I'm also, I'm Nadia's colleague in ProForest, and I'm working on the Siak Palalawan in Riau province in Sumatra landscape program, partly in sort of helping a coalition of companies in that landscape.
Right. Good to have you with us all. Okay, so we're going to, for the rest of us, just quickly write our name and job title in the chat box. You'll find the chat box to the bottom of your screen, and just type your name and your job title, so we don't have to complete the circle of everybody, because it'll take too long time. And then I'm suggesting one thing, which is like a little bit of an icebreaker, which is to share the highlights of your past work week. And I can give you an example for myself. So I'm here in Asunción in Paraguay, where I've been eating a lot of beef. So combining work with pleasure. And we're working in Paraguay to make Paraguay's beef production more sustainable. So this is just a little highlight of mine here. But you figure out something that's a little highlight of you and your work week, and write it in the chat box. Yeah. So we have a few people already, and please also write a little Twitter style, really short highlight of your work week as well. I'm going to give you just a minute to just write in the chat box, please. Okay, there's a few highlights already from Matthias. He ate chocolate. He ate chocolate on Monday and Tuesday. And Matthias, I suspect that was sustainably produced cocoa.
In San Martin, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Pascal had a productive conversation yesterday on learning processes of the Good Growth Conference. So very relevant, very nice. And David, the highlight is finalizing a transaction, ESG ratings firm where is a non-executive, has been bought by Moody's credit ratings firm. So that means sustainability is going to be mainstream in finance. So that's really important. And now we already heard Procesio introduce himself. Anyway, more highlights from your work weeks? Okay. So I think we will continue. Let's get into the topic of the futures methods concept, and David is going to give us a presentation. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody. Hopefully you can now see on your screen the presentation. I'm sharing it. So let us, and I wanted to just go back to what Leif was saying right at the beginning about even with the sharp planning and risk management, something can happen which you hadn't expected, or something might not happen that you had been hoping for. And what this session is all about is working to have the anticipation for success, or to deal with the things which come up apparently from nowhere. And rather than starting with theory, I'd like to start with a story. And that story is of a company which isn't necessarily fantastic on sustainability, but is certainly very good on futures, and that is Shell. So the oil and gas company, in the late 1960s, it was called the Ugly Sister by Forbes because it was one of the also-rans of big oil majors of oil and gas companies. And in 1972, they set up a scenarios team who looked at what's going to happen to the oil price. And when they did lots of deep analysis, they thought, actually, it's very possible for the oil price to soar because it's possible for that to get controlled by the Arab nations who are becoming increasingly important to the supply of oil. The rest of the oil and gas industry hadn't thought that through. They just assumed that oil would remain cheap forever. Then through the 70s, with the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Iranian Revolution, oil prices did go up massively compared to what they were before. And Shell was much better prepared. It had anticipated that change in a way which the other oil majors had not. Then, in the early 80s, the other oil majors assumed, and everybody assumed, that oil and gas would remain at a high price. But Shell created scenarios which explored other possible futures, and in one of those, OPEC fragmented and no longer maintained that high price. And then Shell realized that what would happen next is industry consolidation, if that was to happen, and started preparing. What would it do if there was a low oil price? Who would it buy? How would they buy them? Through the 80s, then OPEC did fragment, and what had been called the Seven Sisters, the largest oil and gas companies, started to consolidate. And because Shell had anticipated what would happen, it was in a much better position to ride that consolidation to become one of the breakout leaders of the oil and gas industry. So across 20 years, having scenarios and really integrating those into their planning and implementation meant that Shell had a broader, deeper, and more rounded understanding of what was going on, and therefore was able to give rise to superior performance. And that's going to be basically the message of this whole session, is that using futures, using the right futures techniques, helps you to see broader, deeper, and in a more rounded way, which means that you can have more chance of getting done what you want to have done. But it's not just oil and gas companies, it's not just big corporations which can do this futures work. On the slide here, I have three examples, one of which is very famous in the world of futures, and that's the one on the left, the book Clem Sunter, The World and South Africa in the 1990s. So he was just a writer, and he lived in South Africa in the 1980s, and he wrote two scenarios and put them in this book. One is called The High Road, and the other one is called The Low Road. And it was about what might happen with apartheid and South Africa. And in The Low Road, the white population tried to hold on to apartheid for as long as possible, and that ended in disaster in that scenario. And in The High Road, the white population made space for a greater democracy, which included more than whites, the blacks and Indians and others of people of color across South Africa. And these scenarios in this book is credited with changing the minds of really important people in the South African government and in the South African establishment, which then helped P.W. Botha open up and allow Nelson Mandela to be released from prison. And from there, we know the rest of the story. So really, really important use of scenarios. And that's just from writing a book which was read by the right people. On the right, we have some other examples. The four colored boxes there are from a piece of work on the future of protein, so very much in that beef world that Leif was talking about earlier. That's from my old home, a forum for the future. Been looking at the future of meat and protein for the last 5 or 10 years. And you can see there, those are different names of different possible worlds which companies, farmers, governments need to plan for in order to make sure we have enough protein into the future. That came from a collaboration between companies, civil society, and beyond. And then finally at the bottom, civil society futures. That was an independent inquiry funded by some foundations in the UK about how will civil society in the UK develop over the next 10 years, and what should it do to address the problems that the UK has. So again, not a company, but instead a collaborative venture to get the most out of a system and a situation. So all of those are different stories of using scenarios and futures planning, very different settings, can be done on the cheap, can be done very expensively, can be done alone, can be done en masse, in collaborations, but all of which is about anticipating for success. So that all takes us into what are these futures methods? How do we define them? So on the left there, we're talking about futures methods as rigorous techniques to understand what might happen in order to take action now. And there are many, many different techniques within the futures and futurology approaches. Scenario planning is one, using trends is another, horizon scanning, where you look across the horizon, what you can just see on your peripheral vision, that's another, and then backcasting, where you look at what your preferred situation is and then work backwards to how you might get there. That's also a futures technique. And finally, there, visioning, where you say, that's the future I want. Those are all part of this futures toolkit. And one of the things we'll do later is we'll work through which is the right futures method for your situation. And on the right, it just expands on this idea about why, what makes futures methods different from normal planning. In normal planning, it's often you roll forward what you're doing now and tinker it and change it just a little bit and assume the future will be today plus a few percent. And what makes futures methods different is they ask you to go broader, be more rounded, and go deeper. So broader because you're not just looking at today plus a bit, but you're looking at what's possible, what's probable, and also what you prefer. More rounded because you're looking at how things are connected to each other and this holistic view, looking at a different range of sources and a range of disciplines. And then deeper because you're wanting to challenge your own assumptions about how the world works and look at what the connections are and those standard views, those things that everyone believes the future will be like. So remember back to that Shell story, in the early 70s, everyone believed that the oil price would stay low. That didn't turn out to be the case. So what are the pieces of assumptions about the futures to keep on challenging? So next, so why use futures? Well, as Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist who won a Nobel Prize, said, it is very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So the point here is not to make accurate predictions, but instead understand what's going on. And that's what the second quote there is saying, which is a futurist maxim: all future predictions are wrong, some futures methods are useful. So the point about using a futures method is not that you accurately predict exactly what's going to happen. It is that you have explored the range of what might happen, you've anticipated all those different things, and then you've built into what you're doing now an ability to respond depending on what does happen. And that means you have these different kinds of reasons for using futures. So you have that broader, deeper, and more rounded understanding. From that, you can generate more options on what you can do for success. Just as importantly, you have what some futurists call prepared minds. Because you have a group of people who together have explored different futures, they have a shared perspective and they have had to think through, what are my assumptions? What do I believe to be true and how do I know it's true? And therefore you're better ready for events. It also is about anticipating risk and improving your risk management. You can feed more different and more detailed risks and mitigation into your risk management processes. And I would say you can use future processes at any stage. So many of you have your national action plans and you're into your implementation, and you can use those futures methods to understand how to go forward from here. It's even more important or even more useful to use it in the design phases early on when you're coming up with what those strategies are. And in the illustration there at the bottom is what's called the futures cone. Today is on the left, the future is on the right, and what that cone is illustrating is we often just plan for the probable future, that light blue dot in the middle. There's actually many more, there's a much wider range of things that could happen. the furthest extent of the cone is what's possible. The second extent is the plausible. Within that, there are different scenarios you might be able to articulate. There's a preferable future where you may want to end up, and there are wildcards. And what futurists mean by wildcards are just events that come out from seemingly nowhere. And part of the point here is, by looking across all of that cone, all those different scenarios, you can have that broader, deeper, more rounded understanding, which means you can do better as things go forward. Now, there are a range of different futures methods, and here are just 4 for you. When it comes to one, so road mapping on the top left there, is where you can often understand exactly what's going to happen, and you can then coordinate in order to match shared needs. So the most important example within road mapping is from silicon chips. Some of you may know that so all of you will know, we are speaking to each other here because there has been a digital revolution, quite an amazing one in many ways. We're using Zoom. That relies on silicon chips and the ability of electronics. That electronics itself rests on something called Moore's law, that the price of those chips has halved every 18 months, basically for the last 50 years. And the reason why that has happened is because Motorola and other companies have come together to do road mapping, to understand all of the different technologies which are becoming available, and to align them so that the quality keeps on getting better, keeps on getting cheaper, and then they compete on the basis of that roadmap. So road mapping has been the backbone of delivering the digital revolution. Bottom left, forecasting is where you extrapolate trends forward to better allocate resources. You'll be very familiar of that with standard planning. Bottom right, scenario planning. That's where you use different stories of different plausible futures to explore that variety, and then from there say, what do we need to do now? And at the start, I gave you the story of Shell and how they use scenario planning to be ready for the change of events when oil prices went high in the 70s and then went low in the 80s. And then finally, on the top right, 3 horizons is a method where you're trying to create a shared vision together that you then mean you can coordinate a lot of people who are trying to act in a particular direction, even though the context remains very uncertain. And an example there would be the SHINE project, which has been in Fife, which is a region in Scotland. Every year they've got together people who work in health and social care. So that's doctors, nurses, old people's homes, people who are working with people towards the end of their lives. And that project has brought them together, and they have visioned what would we want our healthcare system to be for people who are very ill and towards the end of their life? What would we like that to look like in the future? And then how do we work together to get towards that future? And the 3 horizons method is the method they've been using for that. Just move on to the next slide. So at this point, I pause for questions and open up to anyone and everyone for your thoughts and responses to my download there of the different futures methods. Remembering the key message here is there are many methods. There's going to be the right one for you. The point of using them is to have that broader, deeper, and more rounded understanding from which you can anticipate what is needed for your success. So over to you.
Yeah, the floor is open if anybody has questions. Meanwhile, I can just remark, I think everybody is probably thinking the same when I saw your funnel model, right? And when we do projects, we often we do the logical framework, right? Which is really mostly, I think, probably mostly about the preferable outcome. Yeah. So you can say that we live in a very small area out of all this potential, plausible, possible outcomes, yeah? And so that's definitely a restriction and probably one of the reasons why some of our projects or processes get stuck.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions of clarification? Otherwise, I think maybe just carry on, David.
I have a question, David.
Pascal.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. My question is, all of this seems pretty logical and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
About, this is how we lead our life. We do that intuitively. Here, the idea is to do it systematically, to think about the future, not intuitively, systematically. But I've been in this field of development for 25 years now, after being in business. In business, it's common practice. In development, it's not. I haven't seen many projects being developed or many civil society organizations embracing that in their management system. I just wonder why. Is that too costly?
I think it's difficult to, I suspect it'll be different across different organizations and situations. One guess would be that businesses are used to the idea that they're in competition and that what other people do affects their future, and that they can't control everything, and therefore they need to think about how their competitors might respond, and therefore they look outside of themselves. I think my experience of when I've worked with governments and with some civil society organizations, they've tended to assume that all events are under their control, and therefore it's almost like they don't anticipate the need to look outside of that. And almost to what Leif was saying earlier, that the preferable future is the one that you can make happen. Perhaps it's easier to fall into that assumption outside of business, but I think, in a way that's a guess. I would, in a way, I'd be interested in what your thought is about why UNDP more widely, or other civil society organizations, other development organizations haven't acted like the businesses you've been involved with.
I would have to think more about this. It's obviously a very complex question, and a lot of assumptions come to my mind, but I think there is the structured, rigid framework that is imposed by development finance may just be part of the equation, but there's probably more to it than that. Anyway, thanks.
My pleasure.
Right. David, I think we should move on.
Sure. So the next part is, well, this is all very well, but how can you choose from the massive range of different methods? How can you choose the right one for you? And so one of the ways of doing that is by understanding your situation and choosing a method which matches with some of the key characteristics of where you are. And this is what this little grid is going to be. And in a minute, we'll ask you to fill in a poll which just gives your answer about where you think your situation sits within this grid. And the grid has two dimensions. One is uncertainty. So how easy is it? How much confidence can you have in your predictions about the future? So if you are uncertain, if you have high uncertainty, you can't have any real confidence in your predictions about the future. If there's low uncertainty, you can have high confidence in your predictions about the future. And then the other dimension here is agency. How much ability do you have to act? How much can you make choices that will make a difference? And you can see here again, there's high agency, you have a great deal of control and your choices make a difference. Low agency, your choices make almost no difference. And from that, you get a 2x2 grid like this, which has these 4 different stations. So box A you can't control what happens, but you can confidently predict it. Oops. Just trying to advance our slides. B, you can control what happens, and there are many ways things, sorry, you cannot control what happens, and there are many ways things could turn out. C, you can shape what happens, and you can confidently predict it. And then finally, D, you can shape what happens, your choices can make a difference, but there still are many ways that things could turn out. So that's our 4 boxes, A, B, C, and D. And what we're going to do now is have a poll which will ask you which of the 4 quadrants best describes your situation that you face with your NAP or RAP. So I think at this point I hand over to Matthias to do that poll.
I suggest you go back one slide and let people take a look at it first for a few seconds, and then I'll send the poll out.
Yeah. So also we have a few people who are not necessarily in a specific, let's say, production country or so. So I suggest that you think of a country that you are working a lot in, and try to imagine the situation there. It can be, you know, supporting a project, or that maybe you have lived in or so. So think about that, everyone, where you belong in each of these quadrants.
So the poll is in your screen. You can take a look at the poll and also look at the quadrant and choose your letter.
So in a few seconds, when everybody have made their choices, then Matthias will show us the results of the poll. So we can get a feeling of where people feel they are.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to ask you another thing, and that's we want to divide you up in subgroups for discussion in a minute. And because the poll is anonymous, we'd like you to write in the chat box the letter that you chose. Yeah, so everybody, you choose a letter in the poll, and in the chat box, you go and write that letter also, so we can see what you chose. So we only have 2 groups, basically B and D. Please, everybody who chose, write your letter also in the chat box, because Matthias needs it to develop the, to divide people up in groups. All right, so there's a lot of B's here. Okay, but we have at least some representation in the D group, but most of us are 63% in the B group. That's interesting. Please continue to write your letter in the chat box. I'm going to call on somebody to ask you why you chose. So let's say you, Rini. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here live.
Yeah, Rini, why did you choose B?
Yes, because I think what we are dealing now, especially with the National Action Plan, this is really, we really depend on the government political willingness, and also the stakeholders, other stakeholders influence, and then And then that's something that we cannot really influence and things that we cannot control. Actually, what we're having right now, I can give you the example. Last year, until I think August last year in 2018, we were not sure how the legal umbrella of the National Action Plan will be. Well, from the steering committee of FOXI, they are suggested a presidential instruction. But then in August, the Ministry of Coordinating Affairs instructed that the National Action Plan should be included under the ISDO presidential regulation. So we work on combining and inserting the National Action Plan into the draft presidential regulation of ISDO.
Yeah.
But then in December,
Rini,
yes.
it gets very technical for many people, but I think I think we follow you the logic. We understand your logic.
Okay. Yeah. So that's it. I mean, we cannot control it, and then it's out of our hands actually.
Right. And maybe also hear from Siamsul. You chose D. Why did you do that? Really quick.
Okay, I choose D because first I see how the political situation, especially here in West Kalimantan, after the governor's election, and yeah, basically the governor has a very good concern on oil palm issue, especially, and yeah, based on the provincial midterm planning, he also want to make like sustainable. He also want to meet the sustainable development goals achievement in West Kalimantan. So I think in some case, yeah, during the provincial action plan, we could shape what will happen, but
right.
But in other way, we also realize that there is some lack of commitment from the technical office. So in the broader picture, the province is really concerned about it, but in technical issue, there is still something to improve or fix, so that the target and the implementation could run better.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I think that's very interesting. What we're going to do now is that we're going to give the word back to David, and David is going to also talk a little bit more about the instruments available. So David, please continue with your presentation.
Sure.
And I just encourage, if somebody has not written their letter in the chat box, please do so while David is talking.
Great, thanks, Leif. And it's great to hear the examples actually from Rini and Simon and the other gentleman there. So, as some of you may have guessed, each of the different boxes actually lines up with one of the methods that I had mentioned before. So, where you have when you can't control and you can't confidently predict, there's standard planning. B, which many of you are in, most of you are in fact, that's very well suited for scenarios. D for 3 horizons, and C for road mapping. And what I'll do now, whilst Matthias is looking into the groups, is I'll expand a little bit more about each of those. So just a word on standard planning. It has its uses, particularly when you can confidently predict what's going to happen, and you can use your past experience to predict the period ahead. The graph on the right is a revenue forecast for Netflix, and you can see that the person who has made this graph is just assuming that Netflix's revenue growth will be today plus 5% forever. And if that turns out to be true, that'll be a fantastic way, and Netflix will make the right choices. But the thing here is to be beware of false confidence that just because things have been steady in the past and have changed in a consistent way, that they'll do so into the future. For instance, in the case of Netflix, Disney is launching its own subscription service, and it's going to try to disrupt Netflix. But nevertheless, standard planning has its place. The one where many of you ended up was scenario planning, and that's when you can't control what happens, and there are many ways things can turn out. And on the right is an example of a set of scenarios. This was developed by my colleagues and myself, reflecting how urban megacities in developing countries might go forward for the next 20 years. You can see the different illustrations there. And the way of going about scenario planning is firstly to identify who is it that you need to have involved. Then you need to generate many different scenarios, not too many that you can't even hold them in your head, but also not so few that you're not exploring the variety. There are, and you won't be surprised to learn, many different ways of generating different plausible future worlds. The example on the right shows one of the most familiar ways, which is to have two axes, a vertical and horizontal axis, where each axis is material, so what happens matters. It is uncertain, so there's a large variation that it could have. And also the two axes are not related to each other. So when you plot the range, you don't end up with just two worlds, you end up with four worlds. And in this case, the two axes, the two things which were uncertainty were how dominant was fossil fuels, and the vertical axis, high dominance to no dominance, and what is the nature of planning? Is it top down on the left to bottom up on the right? And you see that generates four different worlds. The next thing you need to do is look at the risks and opportunities and how to be successful in each of those worlds. So you would plan as if Sprawlville was going to be the thing that was going to happen. And then you would plan as if Community City was exactly the thing that was going to happen. So you dive into each scenario and then pull out in step 4 and look at what works across all the different scenarios and therefore are no regrets actions. You can do them and be confident they'll work out. And which only work in 1 or 2, in which case you need to prepare to do them. And then you're looking for a trigger which says, this one particular feature is happening now and therefore we need to trigger that plan. That's all information that you need to feed into how decisions are made, including your risk management, and then implement it and checking regularly for those triggers which tell you, we're heading off in this particular direction and therefore our plan for what would happen in that direction, we need to start. So some key points. One is about time horizon. If you make your time horizon for your scenarios too close, then you just recreate today. But if you make it too far into the future, then it feels irrelevant to people. So you're looking for a time horizon which is interestingly different from today, but still relevant. And say 2030 is a good one, particularly as that is also the deadline for the SDGs. You need to make sure the scenarios are different from each other, as well as different from today. And there is a particular variant of scenario planning where you just take your current scenario and place it, sorry, your current strategy and just place it in these different worlds. And that's called wind tunneling, something you can do. So that's scenario planning. Road mapping, I spoke earlier about the technology roadmap for semiconductors, how that's been at the heart of creating our digital world. That's the road mapping technique, and it's when you can shape what happens and you can confidently predict it. And that's where you can identify who. So the steps here, identify who needs to be involved, understand the trends, create your vision, plan your route, identify your risks, and then implement, which will often mean coordinating and working together on a base load of things. And then you can keep on iterating your roadmap. One of the interesting things here is that the act of road mapping itself can draw to you the resources you need to make the roadmap to happen. As it gives the appearance of certainty, as it creates that certainty, then more and more of the resources, allies, partners you need can come towards you. If you're going to make a roadmap to happen, then each of the people who are on that roadmap need to trust that the others will do the things that they've said they're going to do. So growing trust and keeping it is vital. And of course, a roadmap is something you can use to monitor progress. How far are we along? And based on what Pascal was saying earlier, it's possible that your log frames are in effect a kind of roadmap. And it's interesting how almost nobody, I don't think anybody ended up with road mapping as the technique. As box C is the right place. So that's an interesting contrast. And then finally, there is 3 horizons. And the diagram on the right illustrates the 3 horizons. So horizon 1, H1 in red, is the current way of doing things. And in a 3 horizons approach, that current way of doing things is struggling and is going to decline. It will eventually be replaced by horizon 3, some possible future system which will meet the emerging need, but you can't just jump from horizon 1 to horizon 3. You need to pass through a transition and transformation zone, which is horizon 2. And the way of doing this is, back over the left, you need to start by identifying what is the way that your current way of doing things is struggling. What is the horizon 3? What is the visionary aspiration that could replace it over time? Then third, what in today are the inspirational examples that can show the way forward? And then step 4 is to choose which innovations and different ways of doing things to push, which can create that second horizon. And then finally, what are the essential features to maintain? So there are things which are happening today, which would be good to keep on happening. And often one of the ways in which change is stopped is because people fear the things that they value will be wiped away. So if you can demonstrate that essential features will continue into the future, then it makes it a lot easier for people to buy into the entire change process, and then you implement. One of the features of using 3 horizons is it can become a language and a way of holding a conversation between lots of different parties who may not agree on lots of different aspects, but they can at least have a starting point of the current world is struggling. And one of the metaphors people who use 3 horizons use is that it's a way of stewarding towards a preferred future. So that is what I was going to say by way of the different methods. Scenarios and 3 horizons were the most talked about, or the boxes for B and D were the ones where most people ended up. And back over to you now, Leif, on the groups.
Right. Thank you very much, David. So our idea was to try to group you together according to your choices in the poll and have a group discussion. So we'll have about, let me see here, we'll try to have 15 minutes for the discussions. Let me just see here. The three discussion topics are basically in the subgroups are basically: 1, are you able to adapt your project or platform process to accommodate for unforeseen changes in your context? So we know we have project designs and budgets and human capacity and government priorities, etc., etc. So are you able to adapt that to accommodate different other scenarios or future situations? And B, what existing mechanisms might you have that allows you to make those changes? And then finally, could the futures methods that David presented here, could they be useful for you to work with these uncertainties in a structured way, and why? So if it's okay with everybody, Matthias is going to push a button and we all go to the group that we selected. In each group, I see it's only myself and Siamsu who are in the D group, but there must be somebody else, I think. So anyway, if somebody who haven't chosen yet, they might join us in the D group. Otherwise, we need a rapporteur to basically just give a very, very short feedback to the plenary when we come back in the plenary, summarizing the discussion you have had. And maybe I can just pick on somebody to be the rapporteur. Maybe Veronique, would you like to be the rapporteur from the B group?
Yeah,
David,
no problem.
right, and then David has written to me that he's also in the D group. So let's go to the groups. Let's discuss these three questions, and we come back. I'll be the rapporteur from the D group, and we come back in 15 minutes and just give a little bit of feedback about the discussions we've had.
Sounds good. Here we go. Hello, Tree.
to the main session.
Linear plannings, but we need to adapt. So sometimes it's still difficult for us to convince the donor when the interest of donor, and it means we need to reach the goal of the projects from the perspective of the donor, but that's differ with the interest of the government. Now, this thing is one difficult things for us. Then we need to be more adaptive and to strategize how to accommodate both, so we can be on track with donor expectation, but we can also fulfill the government interests to reach the goal at the end.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump in right there. Ibu Tri, we just heard the last of your breakout group discussion. So it's great to hear that you seem to have had a good discussion there. But we're back in plenary now. And let's just hear a summary from each group of your discussion. So I'm going to give the floor to Veronique as the rapporteur from the B group.
Okay.
And you
Thank
just
you.
have a very brief, like 5 minutes or so, to summarize the main points of your discussion.
Yeah, thank you. As you noticed, we were still in the middle of it. We had a good good discussion.
Heated dialogue.
Yes, and I think taking the questions one by one, I think we started by saying that about that in the planning, often because of the mix that Ibu Tri was also just elaborating on, that there is in our group an experience in terms of expectations from the donor, how we sort of typically design and think about the program, often vision of sustainability in mind, and that can differ very much from the realities on the ground, and that we are sort of more traditional in our planning, but that it would be good to sort of include a system into seeing how we can also adapt and link realities on the ground, and that tools of the scenarios, for example, would be useful. When we were discussing about what existing mechanisms do exist to change, we found that that can be quite limited. We were all sort of, many of us in the group took as an example the palm oil sector in Indonesia, and that because of the various actors, there may be limited changes in terms of how we are able to adapt. That said, there was also an example given by Nadia that in their projects, even though there is sort of we're working within this traditional framework, as we called it, there is still a need to adapt, and because things continuously change, and that there was examples in the program in Africa that these changes were made in dialogue and in discussions with the donors. And I guess we were still in the middle of the discussion by saying, and I think this is the comment from Ibu Tri, that in these projects, government are an essential partner and role, and if you have them on board, it's easier, but at the same time, if not, it creates a lot of uncertainty. And how do you then plan accordingly? I don't know if anybody else in the group wants to add, because I think I was just calling some excerpts from the various discussions, because we went a bit in different directions.
Yeah, so any additional comment from that group? I thought it was a great summary. Seems a very interesting discussion you've had.
If I can just add a bit to what Ibu Tri is also trying to elaborate on, is that not only since palm oil in Indonesia is a political and economical issue, there are several government authorities who have interest and priorities over the sector. So it's not spread on just being able to work in good collaboration with one government counterpart, but um, to also bring about a similar or aligned narrative among the several government counterparts who do have certain capacity and interest over the sector.
Right, great. Thank you very much. So in the D group, we started with a bit of reflection on the differences between the majority of people on this in this workshop who chose B, and we were 3 people in the D group, and it seemed that we had maybe a little bit more faith about our ability to shape what happens in a given situation. I think it's probably the most typical for people who work in projects to believe that you have, can do certain things, and then it has certain, certain results, and you can shape that a little bit. So we heard from Siam-Sul how, through interaction with local government officials, so basically through interaction and dialogue, that he felt he had a certain degree of influence on what is happening. And I don't know, I just thought for myself that maybe that's that differs. If you work locally, maybe you feel closer to the decision makers. And if you work in a big country at a national level, it's hard to feel that you're as connected. So that may be a factor there. Then we discussed about the the projects that we're working in, what kind of flexibility we have, and we agreed that had a lot to do with also the time horizon. So in the very short term, within a year or so, it's often difficult to make changes because budgets are allocated, etc. But if we think about a time horizon of a few years down the line, 2, 3, 4 years, etc., then we often felt that we would have some possibility of adapting budgets or activities within our processes and projects. Of course, there's a given max budget allocation in a project, and it's difficult to change. We didn't get a lot of to have a lot of time to discuss the specific methodology for our group, which is the 3 horizons. We think it sounds really intriguing, but probably would need to dig down a little bit more in detail to understand how to use it in a particular situation. So this is basically where we got to. I don't know, David or Siam-Sul, if you have other comments.
Excellent summary.
Thank you. Siam-Sul, are you okay? All right. Okay, perfect. So no protests from my group members there. All right. So this is essentially, we're getting towards the end of our 90 minutes. So we just have a few minutes left. We would like to, at this point, actually launch like a final poll of you, with you, to basically see if this was useful for you. So there are 3 questions. How interesting was the workshop for you? How relevant was it for your work? And then also you need to scroll down in the box a little bit for the 3rd question. Would you be interested in digging deeper in this type of work and know more about the methods? So we said in the beginning, this is just a teaser, an introduction, and we would have to move deeper. So if you can think about this and vote, and we'll see the results in a second. So everyone, please cast your votes.
Okay, I'm sharing the results now.
Yeah, right. Aha. Okay. So interesting results. So the large majority of us felt that this was very interesting. There's about a little third thinking it is interesting to very interesting. So that's encouraging. And also the majority felt that this was very relevant and timely for our work. So already that is great. It's the same way we felt when we planned the workshop. And also 100% response for interest in digging deeper. So this is all very great. Thank you very much for that. What we'd like to do is that we have a few possible ways forward. So we would like to connect David to the participants. We'll have another workshop also in Spanish later on. And we'd like to encourage people to take contact with David directly to get further support on this. David, of course, will have to cover his time going forward, but you're welcome to reach out to David, and we can discuss how to take this forward, this type of planning. So we hope that David will become an active part of our community and a resource person for us. It's also possible for us to plan further types of guidance and support in this area within the green commodities community in the future. So we're going to want to keep this alive a little bit and hear from you how we can better support this in the future. Pascal, do you have any last reflection before we end the workshop?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you to you, Leif, David, and Matthias, especially you, Leif and Matthias, for getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Much appreciated. This is brilliant. David, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody, for participating. It is, for me, it's very clear that we are all very young and very dynamic professionals. Some of us more young than or younger than others. But I think we will be involved in this business for many years to go. And beside using futures method to unlock some of the roadblocks in which we are confronted with now, we will be finding ourselves in places where we can influence the design of future projects. And I think this is where we can make a big difference by acting upstream and looking at how we can look at log frame along different scenarios, as opposed to one single log frame that locks us down. What is very interesting for us is how do we, in the gigantic product or project document that we create, there is very little reference about how future may turn out. There is very few reference about risk management, and I think here we've got to gain literacy if we want to be more prepared to deal with people who have greater control than we have. It's not that we don't have any, but there are people with greater than we have, and we've got to be better prepared for, keeping up with the pace of change. So I feel very excited about this stream of discussion, and I think we've got a lot more to learn from you, David, and I look forward to continuing this. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. It was fantastic to share this with you. And as I put in the chat box, very impressed by the Green Commodities program and the community, all the little stories you told. Do feel free to contact me directly.
All right.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Bye bye.